Hello and welcome to the race edition of today's race weekend data analysis for the French Grand Prix. Now, if you are not familiar with the race edition of the race weekend data analysis, I basically compile all of the lap time data for each of the drivers. We'll take a brief overview of the race as a whole within the first 5 minutes of today's video, and then we'll be comparing each of the teammates together and taking a look at their stint pace and then how they compared against the rest of the season. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so you can happily skip to whichever section of the video you would like me to talk about. But without further ado, and not to waste any more of your time, we will jump on into the race data for the French Grand Prix. And the first thing we will take a look at today is the positional chart. It gets a little bit crazy in the section from 12 laps to about lap 18. In that first phase of pit stops, where the medium tyre runners were going on to the hard compound. We can then see the delayed pit stop of Sergio Perez on lap 24 down at the bottom, where he falls down to P4 and then manages to re-overtake Valtteri Bottas all the way at the very end. We then see the absolute plummeting of Charles Leclerc on lap number 36, going from about P6-ish all the way down to P16 where he finished. So overall, actually a relatively interesting positional chart. But from here, we will now take a look at the lap time chart. Now, this basically just maps on all of the lap time set by each of the drivers. So we can see the first phase of pit stops, then we can see that late pit stop from Sergio Perez right in the middle, and then we can see those hard compound tyre runners coming in the latter half of the Grand Prix. But just zooming in on that big spaghetti noodle pile of lines, we can see it in a lot more detail here, and we can see an absolutely enormous, just over a second per lap pace difference between the top four, the two Mercedes and the two Red Bulls, and the entire rest of the field. Just here by the blue lines on this graph highlighted, we can vaguely see 3 bands of racing, but it's not too well with the last two. It's definitely clear between the top 4 and the rest of the field, but trying to split it up into 3 is a little bit difficult. Post pit stop though, by these green arrows here, the gap between the top 4 and the rest of the field actually spreads at some points to over 2 seconds per lap. Now that pace wasn't held for very long, only 5 or 6 laps. And then by the time we get to these red arrows, that pace advantage has all but disappeared. But in the course of a Grand Prix where there were absolutely no yellow flags, no safety cars, no nothing, they had an overall advantage to the next non-Mercedes or Red Bull car of just over a minute. That is the pure pace that these cars have. Now, the next table that we're going to take a look at is a slightly bit more complex. Now, this is the French Grand Prix 2021 average competitive clean air lap time across the entire duration of the race. Now, firstly, we have the average competitive lap time set in clean air, where a clean air lap was any that was set outside of 2 seconds of the car in front. We then have the gap column to the fastest driver, which was Max Verstappen, then 7/10 back to Sergio Perez. We then have this in the form of a percentage in the column just to the right, and this enables us to compare each of the individual Grand Prix as it negates the track difference. We then have the number of competitive clean air laps, that the drivers had, and then also as a percentage of the entire laps raced, and then finally the standard deviation of their racing laps. This basically just shows how consistent the drivers were across their competitive clean air laps. Now, there is a small little drawback with the standard deviation, as ultimately you want to see a small little decrease in your lines, which means your standard deviation is going to be high. So I am working on a sort of gradient visualization or column or something like that to replace the standard deviation to see if there is a negative gradient with those times slowly decreasing. A more decreasing gradient will be better than a less decreasing gradient, or even an increasing gradient, which would be bad. But anyway, back to the table, we can see that it was the two Red Bulls comfortably clear of Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, who was finally back in the top 4, although joint with Lando Norris. But then what we can do is, taking their percentage pace across all of the 7 races, we can average this out for each of the 20 drivers, and we end up with this table here. Max Verstappen is declared so far the fastest driver of this season, and then it is matched Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton. And they are both 0.27% slower than Max Verstappen so far. Then Valtteri Bottas is the only driver within a percent of Max Verstappen, as it is then Pierre Gasly who is ahead of Lando Norris. This just shows how quick Pierre Gasly has been so far this season. And then doing exactly the same for the teams, we can pull up this table here. Red Bull have extended their advantage and speed over Mercedes. They are now 0.33% faster overall. Ferrari still have the third fastest car at the moment, and McLaren is the fourth fastest. But now what we're going to do to counter a small little issue with this table, as your clean air laps can either fall in the last portion of the Grand Prix or the first portion of the Grand Prix, and obviously that is going to affect your overall lap time. We're going to break it down into each of the individual stints. We're going to apply the same clean air lap algorithm, but only to the drivers that competed on the same compound of tyre in the same stint. So taking a look at what that looks like, stint number 1 looks a little bit like this. Medium compound tyre runners on the left and the hard compound tyres on the right. So the same again as with the previous table, we have the average lap time, which is topped by Lewis Hamilton, and then 1.5 seconds back on the medium compound tyre per lap is Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari. Now everybody that has this bracketed asterisk, these are people that were on the medium compound of tyre, however they had no competitive clean air laps in order for me to take an average, so they have not been included as they did not set a lap time in clean air. And then over on the hard compound of tyre, it was Sebastian Vettel who was the only driver to set a sub 1 minute 40 lap time. Then taking a look at stint number 2's runners, everyone is pretty much on the hards apart from a couple of people on the mediums, in which it is the 2 Aston Martins who have ridiculous pace over the 2 Alfa Romeos, Ocon as well, interestingly, in the Alpine, really struggling, and then Nikita Mazepin also on the mediums for stint number 2. And it was on the hard compound of tyres where the Red Bulls really stretched their legs. They were 0.6 quicker than the 2 Mercedes, which is just highlighted here with Hamilton being 0.634 seconds back, with actually Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly super close behind. Gasly being faster than Ricciardo. He definitely had the pace to take that position over Ricciardo. But there we go, there is all of the race data overview all done and dusted. We are now going to break down each of the individual teams. Each of these, like I said, are timestamped in the description down below, so you can feel free to skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. We are going in 2020 championship order, so we start with Mercedes and run through all the way to Williams. I'll be spending a little bit of time in this Mercedes panel just to explain each of the 4 graphs that will pop up on screen, but then you can skip ahead after that. So on screen is the performances of the 2 Mercedes. We have Lewis Hamilton in the black line and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise. In the top left, we have their lap time charts for the French Grand Prix. And then in the grey dotted line, this is the pace of the fastest car in 2019, which was Lewis Hamilton, who went on to win that race. But then moving to the graph just below, this is the gap on every single lap of the Grand Prix. We can see it's vaguely fluctuating, and especially when they come in for a pit stop. Then the graph in the top right is just their positions on every single lap. And then the graph in the bottom right is their pace percentage difference. This takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, and converts them into a percentage, then orders them from greatest down to smallest. Anything above 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then anything below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. But the first thing we can do is actually split the percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 34% exactly of this Grand Prix, Valtteri Bottas was the fastest Mercedes driver, and therefore for 66% it was Lewis Hamilton. But turning our attention now to the lap chart overall, we can see that this grey dotted line is significantly quicker than their 2021 pace. And interestingly, the first stint overall, they were actually very even by this green arrow here. There wasn't really too much separating them, with the gap raising to 5 seconds, with the pit stop causing the small little peak in the gaps chart overall, and then post pit stop for both drivers, once again they were very even, with Valtteri Bottas sort of faltering just a little bit at the very end of the Grand Prix. But then breaking down all of their times and comparing their clean air stint runnings together, we can see that in their 2019 clean air lap pace, they were 3.3 seconds a lap quicker than they were in 2021, with overall there being just under 1/10 of a second difference between the 2 drivers. With stint number 1 looking a bit like this, Bottas unfortunately not setting any clean air lap times and Hamilton setting a 38.8, and then stint number 2 when they were again on the same compound of tyre, there was a 2.5 difference in Hamilton's favour. Then from Mercedes we take a look at Red Bull, and once again splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 20.8% of the Grand Prix, Sergio Perez was the faster driver, and therefore for 79.2% it was Max Verstappen. This is the most significant teammate difference of the entire Grand Prix, with again their grey dotted line of 2019 pace being significantly quicker than their 2021 pace. And again, much like the Mercedes, their first stint, they were extremely even, with the gap hovering at around 5 seconds. It is Max Verstappen who comes in for his first pit stop by this yellow arrow, which relinquishes Sergio Perez into the lead just briefly, but then Sergio Perez comes in for his pit stop just a couple of laps later on lap 24, which demotes him back down to P4. Then post Max Verstappen's second pit stop, by this dark green arrow, they are again exceptionally even. Just a small little spike in lap times, probably a small little battle with Valtteri Bottas there, just to the right of the dark green arrow, in which the gap rose to about 10 seconds. Then again, comparing all of the lap times and taking a look at their 2019 pace, we can see that Red Bull were actually 1.8 seconds quicker in 2019, compared to Mercedes 3.2. So we can clearly see here that 2021 is a case of Mercedes being significantly slowed down rather than Red Bull actually gaining up to Mercedes, which a lot of people are saying that it is a resurgence of Red Bull. Red Bull have finally caught Mercedes up, and that is simply not the case. Looking at all of the data and all of the lap times, Mercedes and especially Aston Martin as well, they have lost so much more time compared to all of their other competitors. So it is Mercedes being ripped down a couple of rungs, which has brought them to the same level as Red Bull. But now turning our attention to the stint pace, there was an overall pace difference of 0.7 a lap between Verstappen and Perez across the whole Grand Prix. With stint 1 there was no difference able to be taken as Verstappen didn't set a clean air lap time, and stint number 2, interestingly, on the hard compound of tyre, it was Sergio Perez who was just 2.5 quicker. And then from Red Bull we take a look at McLaren, and splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 35.8% of the Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo in the blue line is the faster car, and therefore for 64.2% it is Lando Norris. This is much like we've seen so far this season in terms of pace for Daniel Ricciardo, only occasionally has he been the quicker car. With McLaren's 2019 pace being somewhat similar to the Red Bull pace difference between 2021, and once again both drivers in the first stint being exceptionally even. With Daniel Ricciardo coming in for his pit stop first around lap 16, and then Lando Norris coming in just a little bit later on lap number 24, which demotes him back down to P14, but he fought all the way back to P5. Then interestingly, post-pit stop of Lando Norris, they are fairly even, with Norris being just a little bit quicker per lap, raising the gap from about 2 seconds up to about 10 seconds. Then comparing all of the lap times for the McLaren boys, overall their 2019 pace was 1.4 seconds quicker than their 2021 pace, so a little bit quicker than what the Red Bull time was as well. With there being a half a second difference between the two drivers as well across the whole Grand Prix, and then stint number 1, neither driver set a competitive clean air lap time, and stint number 2 is again that half a second difference, as that is their overall race pace. Then from McLaren we can take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 26.4% it was Lance Stroll in the pink who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 73.6% it was Sebastian Vettel. A much better Grand Prix for Sebastian Vettel. He has really found it comfortable in that Aston Martin the past couple of races. With the Aston Martin pace difference here by the grey dotted line being somewhat similar to what it was with the Mercedes, but not as significant. And once again, both drivers by this light green arrow was so very similar, the gap raising from about 3 seconds to 10 over the course of 25 laps. That is so very close. Both drivers then came in for an extremely late pit stop onto the medium compound of tyres, where again, post-pit stop, they were just exceptionally even. Lance Stroll slightly tailed off, as you can see just at the end of their laps chart, where Sebastian Vettel was able to keep that pace just a little bit longer, so the gap rose from just about 6 seconds to over 10 in the last few laps. With the overall lap times looking a little bit like this, for their 2019 pace there was a 1.7 second difference. So again, just a touch quicker actually than the Red Bull pace, and nowhere near as significant as the Mercedes time loss overall, with 4.5 tenths difference being the gap between the two drivers in Sebastian Vettel's favour. And across stint number 1 on the hard compound of tyre, that was actually 3.5 tenths, again in Sebastian Vettel's favour. And then on stint number 2, it was a little bit quicker, but not quite 4 tenths overall, again in Sebastian Vettel's favour. I should actually highlight which tyres they were on their stints. Stint number 1, both Aston Martins were on the hard, and then stint number 2, they were on the mediums, but I should probably just add a little hard or a medium symbol. Then from Aston Martin, we take a look at the French Alpine team, where one driver had a decent race and the other did not. Splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 30.8% it was Esteban Ocon in the white shadow line that was the faster of the Alpines, and therefore for 69.2% it was Fernando Alonso. With the pace difference of the Alpine 2019 car, which was actually the Renault at the time, being around what we've seen with the Aston Martin, Red Bull and also McLaren. With once again in the first stint both drivers being exceptionally even by these two light green arrows, apart from a couple of slow laps from Fernando Alonso which were caused by these two peaks. It is then Alonso who comes in for his stop first and takes full advantage of his fresh tyre compound straight after his pit stop, being on average about a second per lap faster than Ocon, until Ocon comes in for his stop, where again post Ocon pit stop they are exceptionally even up until lap 44, where Alonso again is about half a second quicker than Esteban Ocon for that whole duration until the checkered flag. But now taking a look at the overall lap times and the differences between the two drivers, 2019 was 2.2 seconds quicker than their 2021 pace, with overall a 3/10 difference between the two drivers in Alonso's favour across the whole Grand Prix. Now, both drivers did start on different compounds of tyres overall, and Alonso did not set a clean air lap time in stint number 1, unlike Ocon who was on the hard compound of tyre. However, for stint number 2 they did, and the difference was just under a tenth of a second, but Pirelli predicted a half a second deficit from the hard tyre to the medium tyre, which would put Alonso's pace at about 4 tenths quicker than Ocon if he was to be on the medium tyre in this stint. Now overall, Pirelli's projections of tyre difference and compound difference isn't the best overall. It gives a good gauge, but it's not overly accurate over the entire Grand Prix distance. However, in this instance, it would be safe to assume that had Alonso shod the medium compound of tyre the same as Ocon, he would have gone quicker, but perhaps not to the extent of half a second. And leaving Alpine, we will now head on into Ferrari, which was a very disappointing Grand Prix for them. But splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 59.6% it was Carlos Sainz in the black that was the faster of the two cars, and for 40.4% it was Charles Leclerc. And this is definitely a minority trend that we have seen so far this season, where Carlos Sainz has been the faster of the two Ferraris. But taking a look at their 2019 pace overall, it is about 2.5 to 3 seconds a lap slower, or quicker, than their 2021 pace. With their stint 1 pace again being exceptionally even, up until that first round of pit stops, which has this small little peak in the gaps chart overall. And then interestingly, an extremely slow stint for Charles Leclerc cost him a on-track position overtake. He was just going backwards and backwards in this Grand Prix up until his second pit stop by this bright yellow line. Which is why Charles Leclerc ended up so far down the order. He had to make that second pit stop overall, otherwise he just wouldn't have made it to the end. And taking a look at the Ferrari's lap times overall, we can see that it was actually 4.1 seconds difference to 2019. That is how bad their 2021 pace was in Le Castellet, with an overall difference between the two drivers being just 3/10 of a second. With stint 1, unfortunately, Leclerc did not set a clean air lap time. However, in stint 2 they did, and there was a difference of just under 4/10 of a second. Then from Ferrari, we take a look at Alfa Tauri, and again splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle. For 28.8% it was Yuki Tsunoda who was the faster car, and then for 71.2% it was Pierre Gasly. And again, unfortunately, this is the same trend that we have seen so far this year, where Yuki Tsunoda just hasn't quite got that race pace just yet, especially to compete against Pierre Gasly. With their 2019 pace being a lot closer than it was in terms of the Ferrari, and once again, stint number 1 being very, very close. I'm not sure what it was about the French Grand Prix, but in stint 1, all of the teammates were so close. Right up until that first round of pit stops where it was Tsunoda who came in first, and then a couple of laps later it was Gasly, and post pit stop by the yellow line, they were fairly even up until around lap 38, sort of time by this dark green arrow, where a gap of around half a second to a second per lap starts to emerge between the two drivers up until the checkered flag, and the gap raises from about 15 seconds all the way up to 35 in the last 10 laps. And I just realised I did not actually initiate the animation for the dark green arrows, but here they are. And then taking a look at the lap times for the AlphaTauri team, we can see that there was a 1.2 second deficit to their 2019 pace overall, so much like we saw with the McLarens. However, the overall pace deficit between the two drivers was 1.1 seconds per lap across the whole Grand Prix in clean air. That is the most significant teammate difference of the entire race. Where stint number 1, neither driver set a competitive clean air lap time, and stint number 2, it was this 1.1 second difference. And then from AlphaTauri, we will take a look at Alfa Romeo, and splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 48.1%, it was Antonio Giovinazzi who was the faster car in the white line, and then for 51.9%, it was Kimi Räikkönen in the red line. And again, this exceptionally even trend is something that we've seen so far throughout this entire season. With the Alfa Romeo of 2019 being roughly in some parts 4 seconds per lap quicker than their 2021 pace. And once again, during stint number 1, as we've seen so often in this Grand Prix, they were exceptionally even. A touch inconsistent, but we can see that for most of the drivers throughout this Grand Prix. It is Giovinazzi who comes in for his pit stop on around lap 30-ish, and then we have Kimi Räikkönen come in for his pit stop just after that, a couple of laps later. And then post this pit stop, it was Giovinazzi who was the more consistent driver, as we can see Kimi Räikkönen's line going all uppy downy, uppy downy, uppy downy, whereas Giovinazzi was a sort of horizontal line. However, they didn't really have any pace progression whatsoever, like we saw with the Aston Martins, where they had a nice negative gradient. They sort of stayed the same overall. They didn't really have much pace at the end of the Grand Prix. And looking at the Aston Martin's lap times overall for 2019, there was a 1.7 second deficit to 2019 overall, with a 1.5 tenth difference between the two drivers. With the stint 1 pace looking a bit like this, they were on slightly different compounds overall, with Giovinazzi not setting a lap time in clean air. And stint number 2, the difference was just under 1/10 of a second. And so moving from Alfa Romeo, we take a look at the penultimate team of today's episode, and that is Haas. And splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, for 36.5% of the Grand Prix, it was Nikita Mazepin in the white who was the faster car, and then for 63.5%, it was Mick Schumacher. So again, a fairly consistent trend that we've seen so far this season. Sometimes it's been 70-30, sometimes it has been closer to 55-45. But taking a look at their 2019 pace overall by the grey dotted line, it's about 2 seconds, maybe 1.5 seconds. We'll take a look a little bit later on. And again, their stint 1 is just exceptional. I don't know what it is about stint number 1 at this track. Each of the teammates were just very even. But it is Mick Schumacher who comes in for his pit stop first off of the medium compound of tyre, as it is Nikita Mazepin who is on the hard. They went for a slightly split strategy overall. Nikita Mazepin then comes in for his pit stop around lap 32, and then post pit stop they are exceptionally even, when Nikita Mazepin is on the faster medium compound of tyre, and then Mick Schumacher is on his old hard compound of tyre. And interestingly, right at the very end, within the last 5 or so laps, Nikita Mazepin has an enormous pace drop-off, and Mick Schumacher actually quickly improves his pace overall. But taking a look at those lap times between the two Haas cars, they lost 2.4 seconds on their 2019 pace. With stint number 1, their clean air running looking a bit like this. Schumacher was around 4/10 faster than Nikita Mazepin, but again, Pirelli project that half a second compound difference between the hard and the medium. With stint number 2 looking a bit like this, Mazepin was actually the faster car in clean air overall, but again, we have that half a second pace difference as Mazepin was on the mediums and Schumacher was on the hards. And then finally, for the race edition of the race weekend data analysis for the French Grand Prix, we will take a look at Williams. And we'll split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and very similarly to Haas, it was 38.5% in favour of Nicholas Latifi in the blue, and 61.5% in favour of George Russell in the white. With their 2019 pace actually being exceptionally close to their 2021 pace overall. And once again, their stint 1 pace being almost identical. This is such a bizarre Grand Prix for the data this race. With both drivers coming in for pit stops at near enough the same time. However, post pit stop by this yellow arrow, Nicholas Latifi is around a second a lap sometimes, but on average about half a second a lap slower than George Russell, which raises the gap from 5 seconds post pit stop to about 20 seconds nearer the checkered flag, where actually Nicholas Latifi does actually have a bit of a pace turn on George Russell, which lowers this gap from 20 seconds to 15 at the checkered flag. Then taking a look at the Williams lap times overall, we can see that they've only lost 0.8 on their 2019 pace, overall the least time loss for their 2021 car. With the difference between Russell and Latifi being 2.5 tenths in the Britain's favour. However, in stint number 1, it was only Latifi who was able to set a clean air lap time, and then for stint number 2, there was just under a 2/10 difference in the Britain's favour. And there we go, there is the end of the race edition of the race weekend data analysis for the French Grand Prix. Please let me know of anything in the comments down below if you have any comments about this series or anything that you would like to change or add or comment on in general. Please let me know and I'll do my best to respond to all of those comments. I do again apologise for the slight reshuffling of this upload schedule, but I'm slowly working around it and I'm falling into a nice routine. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.